What's up, everyone? I'm an MTG Theory Crafter, and this is episode 5 of our Tempo series. So, last episode, we took a look at the graphs of probability distributions generated by different deck archetypes. We said that in order to understand how these probability distributions were generated, we really need to understand how the deck archetypes win the game and why their distributions look like that. Well, let's just jump right in. Um, First, we need to understand what a deck archetype actually is. Well, a deck archetype is a way to classify a deck, and the way we classify decks is based off of how they win the game, and subsequently what cards they include in their deck in order to win the game. I would also argue that they are based off of how their probability distributions look like. And so in Magic, traditionally there are three main archetypes, which we say are aggro, combo, and control. And they correspond to these three probability distributions that we looked at in the last episode. And I'm going to go through and talk about each of these archetypes and then why they match up with the distributions that I showed. So let's start with aggro. Aggro is generally defined by playing many high tempo creatures. Now, these are creatures that basically have a high damage output per the mana that they cost, right? A classic definition of tempo based off of what we've been talking about in the last episodes. And so a lot of the times you'll see 1 mana creatures that have 2 power, or even 2 mana creatures that have 3 or even 4 power, or that may have an ability like haste or first strike or another combat related ability. What you also find is that they'll play some or very few removal, and mainly the idea for this removal is to remove blockers so that they continue attacking, much like in the examples that we saw in episodes 1 and 3. And the reason we picked red is because red actually is unique in that it has burn, which are cards that can essentially target anything, like our lightning bolt or lightning strike. In other words, they can target creatures to kind of allow our creatures to continue attacking, or they can target the other player to end the game sooner by dealing damage directly to the opponent. Now, the thing that kind of classifies or that really characterizes this deck is that that it has a redundancy in interchangeable or replaceable threats, and that means that there's not just one card that is a 1 mana 2 power creature. There are a lot of 1 mana 2 power creatures. They each have their upsides and downsides, but in terms of how quickly they can deal damage to the opponent, there's a lot of different cards that can fill that role, not just one. And likewise with the 2 mana creatures, there are a slew of 2 mana creatures that you might want to include in your aggro deck, and they each have their advantages or disadvantages, but they will all essentially try and end the game as quickly as possible. And there's a lot of different options that you have for that, and your deck will have a lot of those things. And the goal of the deck is essentially present a consistent clock that can win the game as soon as possible, and do so with minimal interaction so that it can achieve its goal of ending the game as quickly as possible. And so that's why that's why this red distribution was the one that goes with this archetype. Because aggro decks will generally, because they're attacking with creatures that have power, a certain power, they will never be able to accumulate enough damage to end the game on turns 1 and 2. And very rarely will they maybe be able to on turn 3. Depending on how powerful the creatures are in the game, in the formats that you're playing, etc. I mean, 3 might not even be possible. Like in standard, it would be hard to find a situation or a combination of cards, of aggro cards, that would allow you to win the game on turn 3. Because you're dealing damage every turn. You're dealing like a set amount of damage every turn. But if no one can remove your creatures and your creatures don't have any blockers, on the other side of the battlefield, and that means that they'll be able to deal that damage consistently and usually end the game by turn 4 or 5. And that's what is shown here in this distribution. And then if it doesn't really get it, there may be a few games here or there where it takes an extra turn to kind of deal that last bit of damage because you only drew your 1 mana creatures and no 2 mana creatures, or whatever the case may be. And so this is the aggro archetype. The next archetype we're going to take a look at is the combo archetype. And a combo archetype is there's a lot of different things going on with combos. So instead of playing cards that are trying to, like creatures that are trying to deal damage to your opponent, what a combo deck does is that it tries to play some cards together in a way that synergize to essentially win the game. In Magic, there's a lot of different examples of infinite combos where if you play two cards, on the same turn or one after another, they will interact with each other in such a way as to produce an infinite amount of mana or life or damage or any other way that wins the game. And while not all combos are infinite, generally speaking, the combos will in some way generate an absurd amount, even if it's not infinite, a large amount of mana or cards that the pilot of the deck can then use to leverage that into winning the game, either by dealing a bunch of damage with the mana that was created and the mana and the cards that were generated, or somehow win the game in some other way if there's like a special card that wins the game in a certain way. Apart from those cards that do that, usually, generally speaking, there are not a lot of cards that will interact in this way. There's like maybe one or two cards that has the effect that you're looking for. Ideally with only two cards that will interact with each other. There's usually only one or two different cards that can do what you need for that part of the combo. And you will generally then have to, if you're a pure combo deck, play cards that in some way help you find those two cards, or somehow enact the game plan that you're trying to enact with the combination of those cards. And generally speaking, historically the best color for that was black, because black actually had these cards that we call tutors, which are cards that allow you to search your library for any card. Black doesn't have that as commonly nowadays, but historically that was the case. And so you can basically say that combo decks is all about finding. Combo decks are all about finding a few essential cards that can be played together to win the game. And in terms of what their goal is, it's to present a faster clock than aggro, and do so usually with no interaction, just by enacting its game plan. And so that's why combo decks, their distribution will look a little bit more spread out, because they have a few essential cards instead of many redundant cards. There is a way for them to draw those cards in a perfect order so that they can, or in their opening hand, so that they can win on turn one. There are decks in certain formats that can actually win, combo decks, and actually win the game on turn one, and sometimes even more often than just once every 20. In the oldest formats like Vintage, there are some examples of decks that could win on turn one very often, not just once out of 20. But because it's not a consistent deck, because it needs to find this combination of cards, it's not guaranteed that you will have the cards that you need in your opening hand. Sometimes you will have to draw them from the deck, or play different cards that will help you find them, and which means that you're not always going to win in these early turns. Sometimes you'll need some extra turns to find those cards and then play them together to then win the game. And that's why it's kind of a more spread out distribution that you see here. But again, the reason to play this deck is because it can win faster than aggro. The final deck archetype we'll take a look at is the control archetype. And the control deck essentially aims to play cards that answer both combo and aggro. The best kind of cards for this are general answers that can be used against both decks. The best examples of those are actually in blue, which has counterspells. And the best counterspells are general counterspells that just say counter target spell. And since aggro decks win by playing creatures, and combo decks will usually play by or win by playing some form of instant sorceries, artifacts, or enchantments. Those are all considered spells when they are cast, and so blue has the most general answers with counter spells. But of course, anything that can, also maybe destroy target permanent is also very general. But of course, you can't destroy instants or sorceries. So even those very general cards really are second to counters that can disrupt anything. On top of that, you also, as a control deck, want to play cards that can find you lands in the early game and then the answers that you need in the late game. And blue, incidentally enough, has access to a lot of card draw and also card filtering, like with cantrips, with 1-mana cantrips like Ponder and Preordain and Serum Visions and all these 1-mana cantrips that allow you to kind of sculpt your draws. And so the last thing with control decks is they usually play only a few big threats. They're mostly playing answers to combo and aggro, the other decks or the other decks in the metagame, and they're trying to essentially their goal is to disrupt their opponent as much as possible until they can play their big, very hard to deal with threat that can then win the game. Before the opponent can come back from all of the disruption. And so that's why you have a goldfish probability distribution here that ends the game all the way in these turns. And actually, in fact, some of the most classic examples of control decks might have graphs and probability distributions with win turns, much farther or later into the game. Where maybe they play like an 8-drop and that's their finisher, or 6-drop that wouldn't be able to finish the game for another 3 turns or something like that. But it's just because you're able to disrupt your opponent's win turn, by playing answers, then it doesn't really matter when you can win the game. In any case, that's why you see that these control decks can't win the game early on in the game, because they don't play creatures that will deal damage in the early game. What they're doing in the early game is answering combo and aggro plays. So the 3 archetypes, this is, again, very kind of old school theory about archetypes, and these archetypes kind of have a rock, paper, scissors role in the metagame. And kind of like what we talked about, aggro really sets that consistent expected win turn, and the aggro decks in the metagame, that's kind of what they do. And so combo tends to beat aggro because that's what makes a combo deck good, and that's kind of the role of a combo deck, is to be able to win faster with its combination of cards than aggro can win. And then control comes in and tries to disrupt both of them. But what we find is that because combo relies on specific cards that do unique things, control really just needs to focus on disrupting one part of the combo. And because normally there are not a lot of cards that do what the combo deck wants that card to do, if control can just somehow counter that very important card, then the combo deck might need to find another copy of that card, which there are not a lot of in their deck. And so control is generally better at disrupting combo decks. On the other hand, it's harder for control decks to disrupt aggro decks because aggro decks have a lot of redundant threats. And so if you kill one of their 1-drops or 2-drops, they have a whole bunch of other ones that are going to be ending the game in the same way that that 1-drop or 2-drop, the other one, was going to end the game. And so control needs to have an answer for everything that aggro, every threat that aggro plays in order to beat aggro. And that's not very common, since you're playing not just answers, you're playing also ways to find answers and threats and maybe card draw and some other things in control decks. You usually do not have a 1-to-1 ratio of answers to aggro's threats. And so aggro will usually beat control because control will not be able to answer all of aggro's threats throughout the game. Now, the interesting thing about this is that in order to get an advantage over the decks that they're disadvantaged to, decks will try and move along a spectrum of the three decks. There's an aggro control spectrum, which we will normally is thought of as the fair spectrum, the fair side of things. That's why I have them both on the upper level of this triangle, and they share this kind of top part of it, is because aggro and control are both kind of considered fair decks, and they're considered fair decks because they usually will win through damage using some either a bunch of small creatures, or control will usually, traditionally had like one bigger creature that they could end the game with. Nowadays, there are many different ways to end the game, but that was kind of where the traditional control deck threat was just a very big, creature that cost a lot of mana that could end the game in a couple of turns or something like that once it was played. And they're considered kind of like above board in the fair, area of things. And then aggro and control decks can both kind of degenerate to combo decks into the unfair realm of things. And so there's kind of a spectrum between all three of these archetypes that traditionally was said to occur. And so when we take a look at that, we see that generally speaking, the archetypes that are thought of as between aggro and control are like tempo and mid-range. Tempo is closer to aggro, mid-range is closer to control. Both of these archetypes present threats and also have answers, and kind of how the concentration of each of those things kind of determines whether you're tempo or mid-range. Then we have some, examples of aggro decks that kind of, rely on synergy between their cards. So like elves and goblins are examples of tribal decks where they play a bunch of creatures like aggro, but their creatures are not as strong as aggros, 1-to-1. But when they are all on the board at the same time, they pump each other up, or get a bunch of advantages, and they are going to be doing better than aggro decks on their own. And then you also have other types of aggro combo decks like prowess and heroic decks. Between control and combo, you have things like Fires of Invention, you have the Copycat combo, the Splintered Twin combo, something I'm probably forgetting. There are many examples that you can come up with, and that's thought of to be between control and combo. You kind of control the game at the beginning, and then your win condition, instead of being like one creature that wins the game after a certain amount of turns of attacking, it's some combination that wins the game. The only problem we run into with these hybrids is that there's some other decks that don't really, fit nicely into this classification system. Like we have Hate Bears and Prison and Land Destruction and Ramp are kind of these fair kind of decks. Some are maybe considered unfair, like with Prison or something. And then things really start to kind of break down when you really look at all of the different ways that Magic can be played. And so some of the takeaways that I think we can talk about here is, we kind of started off the episode by saying that each archetype is going to have its own probability distribution. And so, when we try to overclassify things, we run into the issues that we just talked about in the previous slide with, some of these hybrid archetypes. But one thing that is true about all of those hybrid archetypes is that they're all going to have their own probability distribution. We could look at how they win the game, and we could see what turns they win the game at through the goldfish, and we can create a probability distribution for each of those. And an important takeaway from that is that decks will always have a way that they intend to win the game, right? And knowing how decks win just is going to make you a better Magic player. Exposing yourself to the different decks in the format, how the metagame works, that is always going to be to your advantage, because knowing how a deck wins can kind of help you understand what its probability distribution is going to look like, which is inevitably going to help you be able to kind of roughly think about what's happening in a game against that deck. So the model that we created to describe tempo is actually something that we can use to analyze how decks win. and what they're trying to do, how they're going to win games of Magic. In the next episode, what we're going to do is we're going to actually rearrange the terms in the original tempo equation to come up with a modified version of the equation. And then we're going to look at each part of the equation to see what we can what we can glean from the equation about how we can win games of Magic. So I hope you stick around for that next episode, and thank you for listening to this one. Have a good one.